Well, he was on a hunt, not long after that, he was on a hunting trip with some friends, and they went out, flew in his Cessna 210 airplane out to New Mexico, and they were flying back. Weather was clear, nothing wrong with anything, and the airplane, all of a sudden, over Shamrock, Texas, spirals straight down into the ground and kills them all. And there was nothing wrong with the airplane. It wasn't instrument conditions or anything. The FAA said, well, the only thing they could think is maybe he was the only one that knew how to fly and he had a heart attack and no one knew how to pull the airplane out of the dive. We'll never know because the wreckage was so bad. Yeah. But, bottom line is that there were so many after that, so many different witnesses, disappeared, killed, so on and so forth.
Sir, shifting gears, where does the larger story point? We know there's the whole Elohim City element with all these infiltrators, Andy Strassmeyer intelligence, super intelligence, whatever. The Jesse Trinidad document showed the SPLC on phone calls with McVeigh and other people inside the Elohim City compound. And then you have the political elements with Holder and Reno and all the ATF people. And they're still at it today, many of them, pursuing other false flags for political motives. Where does this larger story point, sir, if you could point us in the right direction?
Well, it gets real interesting because it's like going into a building with a lot of different hallways. It just depends which one you want to go down. It's all got the same front door and the same back door, but the hallways go off in a labyrinth. It's a maze in there. What I couldn't understand is we had on day 3, day 4, and day 5, of course, they'd got McVeigh by then and they put him in jail. And all the eyewitnesses were pointing to these Middle Eastern males wearing blue jogging suits that were in front of the building that ran off and jumped into a brown GMC pickup and raced away from the building just as the truck pulled up and so on and so forth. We're following Middle Eastern connections all over the place. The APBs that were coming out had to do with Middle Easterners, Arab types. Then all of a sudden on Sunday, the whole game changed. The FBI raids Nichols' brother's farm, James Nichols, up in Michigan, and didn't find anything up there. They searched the place, didn't find anything. They've got Nichols now. He's turned himself in Harrington, Kansas. We had absolutely nothing to go any direction except to McVeigh and these Middle Easterners that he was somehow connected to. We didn't know how right at that particular time. And then all of a sudden the media does this launch on Michigan, on Nichols' brother's farm, and all of a sudden the whole case changed. Bill Clinton stands up and he makes a statement, there is no Middle Eastern connection, period. Okay, wait a minute, that's all we've got is Middle Eastern connections. What's going on here? And that's when the media launched off on the right-wing, conservative radio talk show host, the militias, and so on and so forth. And I couldn't understand where they were getting all this. Where's all this coming from? This may be the natural enemy of the Clintons, and it may be the natural enemy of the left wing and the communists and the Marxists and all that nonsense. But they're not involved in the Oklahoma City bombing. Now, we haven't got one thing pointing that direction right now. And there, the FBI asked me and said, do you think any militias are involved in this? I said, no. I said, if there was a militia around here and they knew the federal building was going to be bombed, they would have guarded it. Now, if it was the UN building, that'd be a different story. I'd start looking that direction, but not a federal building, a public building. It's like, blowing up the post office. Who wants to do that? There's something else involved here, and something's not right because all we have is Middle Eastern connections. We don't have anything pointing that direction, but the FBI all of a sudden shut down its investigation of any lead that went to a Middle Eastern connection, and they started focusing on militias, the NRA, right-wing radio talk show host, as Charles Schumer said, right-wing radicals, all this kind of stuff. We had nothing going there, and I couldn't figure out what was going on. And then, a couple of months into this thing, my FBI contact guy that I was supposed to be working with called me up and he said, hey, have you ever heard of a place called Elohim City? And I said, Elohim City? What's that? He said, it's a place in Oklahoma. I said, well, I've lived here 40 years and I've never heard of it. And he said, no, it's supposed to be some kind of community in Oklahoma. Well, he knew a lot more about it than he was being honest with me about. I think he just wanted to know if I'd ever heard of it or knew anything about it. And I never had. I had to research it myself to figure out what it was. And it's nothing. It's just a group of houses out in the middle of nowhere woods on the Arkansas border, just inside of Oklahoma. and it's basically one family down there, the Millar's, and mostly relatives, and they got this little Christian identity community thing going. But the odd man out on the whole deal was Andrea Strassmeyer. And then I stumbled onto another deal about LOM City. There was a guy named Dennis Mahon. I knew who Dennis Mahon was, and he knew me. He was a local Tulsa character. He was the Grand Wizard of the KKK in Tulsa, a few years before that. He was involved in all kinds of neo-Nazi stuff. He was a friend of the war, the White Aryan Resistance, and Metzger up in Sandpoint, Idaho. And he knew all these characters. But he was mostly just talk. Dennis Mahon, there's two of them. They're twin brothers, and Dennis was the radical one, and all he did was talk a lot. And they'd go to the Dairy Queen and have their KKK meeting with all 6 guys. I mean, it was no big deal. But I think probably by this time, Mahon was an informant for one of the federal agencies, probably the FBI. Mm-hmm. And he was linking up with Strassmeyer. He was going down and visiting Strassmeyer at LOM City. And of course, I didn't know who Strassmeyer was at the time, but we found out later that his dad was a secretary for Helmut Kohl, who was the Chancellor of Germany, or Assistant Chancellor, whatever it was. And Strassmeyer was in the Panzer Grenadiers as an intelligence officer. And at the time, Germany was having a real bad time trying to deal with an emerging neo-Nazi movement that was happening in Germany. And I think that they sent Strassmeyer over here to try to infiltrate the American end of this, because a lot of the materials they were getting, a lot of the Nazi symbology and all the different things, the accoutrements and stuff, were being shipped to Germany from America, because they weren't even supposed to have it over there, and they sure couldn't buy it. And Mahon was involved in all of that. I think he was supplying Strassmeyer with stuff, thinking Strassmeyer is a good German neo-Nazi that came over here. And Strassmeyer was an informant for somebody, and we just weren't sure who at the time, because FBI swore it wasn't them, but that was the local FBI. It wasn't until quite a while later that the Southern Poverty Law Center connection came up, which brings Morris Dees into it. And because they got linked into this deal, all of a sudden the lights started going on for me. And I'm going, wait a minute. We were after the Middle Easterners until Sunday, then all of a sudden we're after the right wing and the militias. Now, who's the biggest guy out there making money from selling newsletters called Militia Watch and writing books about the militia and the right wing and the militia movement? But Morris Dees. He can make money off this deal. Well, he's got Strassmeyer evidently reporting to him or to the Southern Poverty Law Center, according to the documentation that's surfaced since then. And so that started to make sense. But let me tell you what didn't make any sense. Okay, let's say Strassmeyer's working for him. When it came time for someone to talk to Strassmeyer about his connection to McVeigh, LOM City, the bombing, and to Dennis Mahon, Strassmeyer disappears. And somebody hides him and then smuggles him out of the country. But is it Morris Dees? No. It's Kirk Lyons at the Cause Foundation, which is in North Carolina. And he's the lawyer that is the alter ego, the exact opposite of Morris Dees. As far left as Morris Dees is, Kirk Lyons is supposed to be that far to the right. He defended the KKK in lawsuits against Morris Dees. And now he is working to get Strassmeyer safely out of the country and back to Germany through Mexico. Now, what connection does that have? We got Strassmeyer working for both of them at the same time, or knows both of them at the same time. There's a connection there somewhere. And no one really explored that or said a word about that. That would have been something I would have been all over like a dog on a June bug. And it just didn't happen. So every time we get really hard, good evidence of something going on, it doesn't go anyplace. It's like Janet Davis said, who do you go to with this information if the people that are supposed to take it don't want it, won't touch it? So who's involved? And then, of course, with all this out on the table, we could always go into the Middle Eastern connection through Nichols, if you want to.
Well, we'll leave that for next time, but I do want to bring up the potential for a next attack, because we have Obama advisors, including Robert Shapiro, saying, I know you haven't seen the specific article, but you've probably heard similar calls for a way to boost his sagging popularity with a new 9/11 style or Oklahoma City attack. At the same time, you've got the SPLC and Homeland Security beating the drum for a domestic extremist, right-wing extremist militia type threat all throughout the Obama administration.
Well, there are so many cans that they could open up and dump the worms out of right now. It's pathetic. You can go after the right wing. You can go after. There really isn't any big militia movements left anymore. There's little groups of people and little home defense groups that get together, and individuals, what they call the lone wolf. And I mean, this whole country's on a powder keg right now. Everybody's tired of what's going on. There's people out there that are talking about picking up guns. I mean, it's happening all over the country. We know that. That's the atmosphere right now. Yeah. But what would set off a government crackdown, for lack of a better word, anything could. How about Israel and Iran getting into it? How about us going into it with Iran blocking the Straits of Hormuz? We've got biological terrorism still capable of occurring in this country. We've got all kinds of Middle Eastern terrorists bringing whatever they want across the Mexican border, and the Obama administration doing nothing about it. We've got, you remember the D.C. snipers, the two guys that run around the car just shooting people at random? Well, if you started that with Islamics or people dressed up to look like Islamics and just started shooting people around the country and swearing up and down, taking credit as it's jihad, then you would have the mainstream America against the Muslim community. No one would trust anybody, blah, blah, blah. I mean, any pretext alone. If you had events like blowing up a train, blowing up another airplane, I'm not talking about TW-800 over the water. I'm talking about over the middle of the United States, something like that, a jumbo jet. If you had anything that would precipitate a TSA Homeland Security crackdown, it wouldn't take that much. Anything to do that. Any threat to the population that the media could play up on, such as biological or radiological, a dirty bomb someplace.
Yeah, they'll take any pretext that sells.
Any pretext. They've got a whole toolbox full of them. And the thing about it is, it could happen. And the reason it can happen is because it's happened before. The Amtrak derailment in Arizona, the Oklahoma City bombing, the 1993 World Trade Center bombing, 9/11. They've hit virtually every possible type of terrorist target, except a ship at sea, and that happened with the Achille Lauro. But that's how many people go out and ride a cruise ship compared to how many people go to the post office, how many people go to a clinic, how many people go to a sports stadium, how many people drink the water supply, how many people ride on airplanes. You and I, the only way you can have terror is to have fear. The only way you can have fear is to have two things: an incident and media. If the incident happens and no one knows about it, it's not terrorism because no one's afraid. But if it happens and the media makes it into a bigger deal than it is, and it's everywhere, then we have fear. Then we have everybody demanding something be done. And when you demand that something is done, we end up with things like the 1995 Omnibus Crime Bill and the Patriot Act and so on and so forth. And then what do you do with the population? If you have an outbreak of something in a city, what do you do with the population? You've got to move them to a relocation center. Now, is that starting to sound a little bit familiar?
Putting all the pieces of the puzzle together. Well said, sir, and we appreciate you joining us. I hope we'll have you back on very soon to get even further into this case and everything that's happening in the modern day. Colonel Craig Roberts, thank you for joining us tonight on the InfoWars Nightly News, and we'll be back again tomorrow. So long and farewell.